Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 6th, 2024. Well, it was 79 years ago today that an atom bomb was unleashed on the world when Harry Truman launched a nuclear attack on Hiroshima, Japan. The U.S. was advised to do so by some people in the military, but also a big push from the British, especially from Churchill and from Bertrand Russell, the so-called peacenik, who were saying that the U.S. needed to show this weapon to contain the Soviet Union in the post-war era. It was not necessary to drop a bomb. There were many people who advised the president that the Japanese were in the process of surrendering, preparing to end the war, but it was done anyway for the purposes of the post-war period. So it's worth thinking about this today, about what happened and why, and thinking about it because I would say that we're closer today to a nuclear war than any time since minimally the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the important difference between today and the Cuban Missile Crisis is that in 1962 we had a president, John F. Kennedy, who believed in negotiations, who believed in diplomacy, who believed that if you had the strength to impose your will, it were better to do it through negotiations rather than military strikes. And we were fortunate because we came within a hairbreadth of nuclear exchange in 1962. Now, what Kennedy did was a back-channel discussion with the Soviet ambassador in Washington and then directly with Nikita Khrushchev himself. Through intermediaries. His brother was one of the people, Robert Kennedy Sr., one of the people who engaged in the negotiations with the Soviet Union. But the decision was made that the U.S. would take nuclear weapons out of Turkey in return for the Soviets taking down their nuclear weapons in Cuba. So at the time, it was clear the United States was saying, we will not allow nuclear weapons 90 miles from the American soil. Now, this is very similar to what President Putin has insisted on in terms of Ukraine. His opposition to Ukraine going as a member for NATO is to keep nuclear weapons out of Ukraine within minutes of hitting Russian territory. Now, this is the way diplomacy should work, as opposed to what we're seeing where Ursula von der Leyen said there'll be no diplomacy. The Stoltenberg, the former head of NATO, no diplomacy. Biden, Blinken, we're not going to talk to the Russians. Instead, we're going to keep fighting. We're going to send bigger and longer range missiles into Ukraine, even though that war can't be won. And now with F-16 bombers in Ukraine, the possibility of an escalation is already here. Now, that's when you take a look at this overall situation, and then especially what's happening in Southwest Asia, or what's generally called the Middle East. It's clear we have madmen and war criminals making the policies. And first among these madmen and war criminals is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who's prepared to go all the way, if necessary, to nuclear war to eliminate what he sees as the greatest threat to him and to Israel, Iran, and at the same time conducting assassinations of the very people that are involved in the negotiations with Israel over the hostages and a ceasefire. Again, no negotiations. And so the world is on edge right now because Tehran has not yet responded to the Israeli assassination of the Hamas leader Haniyeh in Tehran. The war buildup continues in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. There's a flotilla of ships. There's squadrons of jet fighters. These are not necessarily defensive measures, just as Netanyahu's attacks on Gaza are not defensive. Who's he protecting Israel from? 3- and 4-year-old militias? So what we're seeing is a steady buildup. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is in Brussels today. He'll be in Tel Aviv later this week for meetings with the Israelis. Remember who Austin is. He's a retired general who then went to work for one of the leading companies of the military-industrial complex, Raytheon. Who benefits from these wars? Who's selling all the weapons? Who's paying for these weapons? You, the American taxpayer. If you live in Europe, you're paying for the weapons buildup that's demanded of the NATO countries. And why? What are you doing this for? What are you protecting yourself from? Putin is not about to send forces into Western Europe. So we're dealing with a situation which is out of control. The other side of this is that the former Russian Defense Minister Shoigu will be in Tehran today to talk with the Iranians, probably to promise some weapons, but also, most likely, to urge restraint. It's clear if Iran wanted a war, they could have a war at any time now. But they have been somewhat restrained. The Israel Defense Forces are telling Netanyahu not to go ahead to war, that their troops are exhausted from 9 months of fighting in Gaza. But Netanyahu is not satisfied. And neither are the clowns and lunatics in the U.S. Congress who cheered him on when he said, "We are at war with Iran." Well, we're not at war with Iran. In Netanyahu's mind, he's at war with Iran. Why? Because as long as there's a war going on, he will remain the prime minister of Israel. As soon as the war is over, he's going to be out. So why is the United States underwriting the continued existence of Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister of Israel? Now, meanwhile, there are jitters in the worldwide financial markets. It's not what you're reading about. It's not just the Federal Reserve interest rates, the uncertainty around that. It has to do with the whole economic system which is coming undone. And the fact that we've moved in the West to a system of speculation, of funny money, away from investment in long-term development of the physical economy. And how are they going to straighten out the stock market drop from yesterday? Something called the Plunge Protection Team, which is essentially a unit of the Federal Reserve and probably the Treasury and other agencies who pump money in selectively to areas where there are weaknesses, just to slosh around enough liquidity to keep people from panicking and selling off everything. Now, what's needed is a radical change in thinking, away from the idea of we're number one, we can impose our will on anyone, we can steal anything we want. It's like Mike Pompeo said at the CIA, what do we train people to do? Lie, cheat, and steal. That's been the policy of the Western governments increasingly. And who are they lying to? Well, they're lying to their so-called adversaries, but they're lying to the populations that live in the countries that they're mismanaging. The time is now for a truthful acknowledgement of failed policies. We need real leaders who can look back and see what we did in 1971 that triggered the speculative system, that broke the physical economy of the West. We need then to look at what happened after 1992 when the system of speculation went on steroids. Remember 2007, 2008? Thousands of people, millions of people, I should say, lost their homes because of the mortgage security scam. The banks got bailed out. That's what's going to happen now. Your pension may be lost the next time the stocks plunge, but the people who are benefiting from that will get their payday from whether it's the Treasury, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's stealing the tax revenue. They'll get their payday, but you're going to have more and more trouble making ends meet. So we've got to get rid of the idea of the sole superpower, that the United States can dictate to the world. I've had the privilege recently of doing interviews with a number of bloggers and podcasters and television interviews in nations in the global south. And you know what they keep asking? What's wrong with the U.S. government? We like the American people, but why is your government insisting on these neo-colonial imperial policies? Today we should think about that. because those are the policies that led to the 2 world wars in the last century and are propelling us into a devastating World War III today. We've got to look at what's wrong with the thinking of the leaders in the US and NATO. Stop playing the election game. Who seems to be more pushing your button? And instead, thinking about what is the future if we continue on this pathway. I'll be talking to Helga Zepp-LaRouche about this tomorrow on our weekly webcast. Stay tuned for links to various other events and written material that you can use in your own organizing. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.